in several reforming countries. Abandonment of these restrictions may enhance the work mobility. And further, fixed salaries may impose a threat on restructuring or firing, even if other markets work well. Before the reforms, the reforming countries were showing very rigid salary structures. Here a lot is being changed, but even in liberalized conditions, there are restrictions of salary flexibility which may seriously hinder restructuring of hiring. Extensive high minimum salaries are restricting the diversion of lower level salaries, and they restrict creation of the salaries at the market level. So the World Bank directly puts pressure to liberalize labor markets and avoid as many state interferences as possible. The outcome was a relatively well-trained, skilled workforce being used by foreign investors, namely German investors, Italian investors, and so on. And like, for instance, as we are now in Slovakia, the main investors they came were Volkswagen or US Steel, as you know. To give an idea of the difference in salaries, which was very important for the new investments, this difference, in 1994, for instance, that was the time just before the big investors came, or when they just were here. I can tell you that the average German wage, when you index it at the time in 1994, was 100. The Hungarian worker costed only 10, a Slovak worker only 6.6, a Bulgarian only 3, and then Ukraine also only 3. That means that the Slovak worker was 15 times cheaper than the German worker, and for instance in the Ukraine it was 33 times cheaper. And for the Philips at the time, they already had quite a big plant in Hungary, and because this Ukraine labor market was more interesting for them, 33 times cheaper than the German and about 4 times cheaper than the Hungarian, they moved their plant from Hungary to Uzhgorod. Similar statistic you can find also with unit labor costs, which includes the factor of productivity. The third pillar of transformation, now we come to the privatization, or the total transfer of the assets. In fact, there were 4 possible forms of privatization that took place in different mixed forms in different countries. The direct privatization, directly by the state through state trust funds, National Property Fund, for instance, Treuhand. Coupon privatization, which was very much used also in Czechoslovakia 2 times before the Czechoslovakia fell apart and afterwards. That is due to a concept of people's capitalism, as it was somehow ideologized already by Margaret Thatcher before. Auctions and restitution to former owners or their heirs. That was the most reactionary form, to my mind, of privatization. And there was always a discussion, a dispute, which firm, which thing to privatize in what form. The state funds were the most important, as you can imagine. Their decisions included also geopolitical directions. For example, in Czechia, when the main industrial plant, Škoda, was to be sold or had to be sold, wanted to be sold, there was Václav Klaus, who wanted to give it to Volkswagen, and Václav Havel, who wanted to somehow continue with the period before the communist period in 1938, when most of the Czech industry was in the hands of French or British enterprises, and Havel stood for the French automobile industry. So Klaus won, as you know, and so this was in a way also a geopolitical direction which was decided by this battle in a way. Privatization process was completed also before the EU enlargement, with the positive side effect for the new owners that now the EU subsidies which are given for instance, training of personnel or investing in weak regions go to the new owners and not to the old, sure. Where did the new owners come from? This is also a very important question because it's quite different. It's not naturally that they come from outside, mostly, but they come from outside, as you can see easily, because in Eastern Europe there was no sufficient capital accumulation on the terrain in Eastern Europe, differently from, for instance, Russia or Ukraine. So the takeovers were made by German, Austrian, later also again German or Italian capital, US capital, Belgium, Korean, Japanese firms. And the most powerful branches ended up totally in foreign hands. Let's look, for instance, at the banking sector, which is, to my mind, the most important sector because it also controls credit politics and further investments by this. So the transfer was completed in this branch in 2002. And at the time already, we could see that 80 to 90% of the bank capital in Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Estonia, it was 99% at the time, were held by foreign investors. Belgium, Austrian, Italian, French. The only exception is Slovenia. We can come to this, but I already noticed a bit the reason before I told you, but we can speak about this when we discuss later on. Different kind of privatization was somehow deruled in Russia, Ukraine and Moldavia. Their local capital accumulation led to regional oligarchs controlling the political scenery. By the way, like the West European investors control the political scenery in East Europe after this, their takeover as well. This local capital accumulation took place, was somehow an arrangement between party leaders and directors of combinats on the regional level. Best you can see this in Ukraine, is the main plant they have there, Krivorostal, it's a steel plant in the east. Before the Orange Revolution, it was already privatized to Pinchuk. He was a nephew, he is a nephew of the former President Kuchma. After 2005, and I would say that was the reason because of the Orange Revolution took place, Timoshenko sold it again, so they re-nationalized the whole plant and sold it again to a now Western main investor, Mittal, the biggest steel factory in the West, which is now Ankelor. And today, after Timoshenko and Yushchenko again lost the field, the new governor, Viktor Yanukovych, the new president, cedes the first legal actions against the so-called irregularities of the last privatization. So it may happen that this privatization takes time, a third time with Krivorostal, the main plant in the Ukraine. So the transition period between 1990 and 2002 ended up in a complete transfer of property. In the East, that meant private instead of collective, and foreign instead of local or national. Yeah, I come to an end, not without looking at the actual situation, because now we face a new crisis after the collapse, the world economic collapse of 2008. This is, by the way, the first crisis the peripheral integration now can see in these countries where the peripheral integration took place. Because since the beginning of the screening process in 1998 to colonize the Eastern Europe with the Western capital, a new formula was found to name the peripheral economies. That was a sort of a propagandistic formula. We speak, economists, liberal economists speak of emerging markets, or you would have heard of Baltic tigers. Today nobody wants to be remembered these propagandistic terms, by the way. Emerging markets reflected the very short period of time between, let's say, 1999, 2000 and 2005, 2006, when growth rates were higher in Eastern Europe than in the core Western countries, which was no wonder because they started from a very low level after the collapse. And we have to note that the growth was profitable only more or less for foreign investors and for some regions, like for instance these booming regions, Bratislava, Trnava, Žilina, with the car cluster of the three main producers. This is not valuable for Trebišov, for instance, where the Roma-Hungary war took place in the middle of this period of so-called emerging markets in 2004. How did this work? This profit the Western investors could make. There is one figure which shows it very well. This is the figure of repatriation of the profits instead of reinvestment. And we could see that in this booming period between 2000 and 2005, 2006, 80% of the profits who were made in Slovakia, or 75 in Bulgaria, or 66 in Poland, were not reinvested, but were repatriated in the cores of the multinationals. This short period of time was based on several economic bubbles. One bubble was the foreign debt. For instance, end of 2009, that's the last figure I could see, the EU members, the new EU members of Eastern Europe, had a foreign debt of 640 billion euro. Second bubble, the foreign direct investment, cumulated till end of 2009 only 460 billion euros. So that means that there's a constant flow of capital, or only out of these two figures, coming from the East to the West. Also, we are trained to think that the West is giving money to the East. It's the other way around, sure. Third bubble, the negative current account, which is far more negative than, for instance, for the West European countries. Second, fourth, a bloated and swollen housing market, which is very important now for the new economic crisis, not only in the United States, but also in Eastern Europe. This boom ended dramatically with the world economic crisis in 2008. Production declined again by average of 15% in Eastern Europe, compared to the EU 15, so to the core of European Union, where it was only 3%. So again, we have all this catching up effect destroyed. There was no catching up effect. With the only exception of Poland, and this is also interesting by Poland, because Poland had and has a relatively strong domestic market to somehow buy and sell within their own frontiers. To summarize, I'm come to an end. The Drang nach Osten was successful for the leading global players of Western Europe in their competition with Far Eastern or US-led locations and regions. In that sense, it became the economic courtyard of the Brussels Union. But the colonization means at the same time the loss of self-reliance, a loss of national, regional culture, and this price of this, what I call peripheral integration, is very high in a social and a cultural way. And I think we should discuss these two things in our discussion round. Thank you very much.